Picture this. It is October 1st, 331 BC, and you are standing in a Macedonian phalanx on a flat plain in northern Iraq. The sun is already blazing, and you can barely see the end of your own battle line through the dust. You grip your sarissa, an 18-foot pike that weighs as much as a small child, and you try not to think about the fact that you are about to fight the largest army ever assembled in human history. In front of you, stretching from horizon to horizon, is the Persian army, 200,000 men. The dust cloud from their horses is so thick, it looks like a sandstorm. You can hear them before you see them. Drums, war cries, the rumble of 15,000 cavalry. Someone next to you mutters a prayer. Another man vomits on his sandals. You are 47,000 soldiers about to charge into a sea of humanity that outnumbers you 4-1. But here is the thing that nobody can explain. By sunset, you will have destroyed them, not defeated them, destroyed them. The Persian Empire, the greatest power on earth, the civilization that has ruled from Egypt to India for 2 centuries, will be shattered beyond repair, and you will lose fewer than 500 men doing it. This is the Battle of Gaugamela. This is the day Alexander the Great stopped being a brilliant general and became a living god. And if you think you understand how warfare works, this battle will break every rule you thought you knew. Before diving into the insanity of this impossible victory, if you enjoy learning about the moments that changed history forever, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. It blows my mind that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with how 30,000 Macedonians conquered the known world. Now, wipe the sweat from your eyes and look at what is coming for you, because you need to understand that you should not be here. You should be dead. Your entire army should have been destroyed 3 times already. And the man leading you is either the greatest military genius who ever lived or the luckiest lunatic in history. To understand why the Battle of Gaugamela should never have happened, you have to go back 3 years to a beach in Asia Minor where a 22-year-old king stepped off a boat and threw a spear into the sand. That king was Alexander of Macedon, and that theatrical gesture was his way of declaring that Asia now belonged to him. The problem was that Asia did not know it yet. Alexander had inherited a kingdom that should not have existed. His father, Philip II, had taken a fractured collection of tribes in northern Greece and turned them into the deadliest military machine of the ancient world. Philip had invented a new way of fighting. He took the Greek phalanx, that tight formation of shields and spears that had dominated warfare for centuries, and he supercharged it. The traditional Greek hoplite carried a spear about 8 feet long. Philip gave his men the sarissa, a pike that was 18 feet long. Imagine standing in a formation where the front 5 rows can all stick their weapons forward at the same time. You create a forest of steel that no cavalry can penetrate and no infantry can push through. It is a walking fortress made of human beings. But Philip did not stop there. While other Greek armies were just infantry, Philip added heavy cavalry. Not light scouts or skirmishers, but shock troops. Knights before knights existed. These were the companion cavalry, aristocrats on war horses trained to charge directly into the enemy and shatter their formations. Philip had created combined arms warfare, infantry to hold the enemy in place, cavalry to smash them from the side. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, everyone expected his empire to collapse. Alexander was only 20 years old. The Greek city-states immediately rebelled. The northern tribes stopped paying tribute. The generals in the army started measuring the throne for themselves. Alexander had other ideas. In 2 years, he crushed every rebellion, destroyed the city of Thebes as a warning to anyone else thinking about defying him, and secured his position. Then he did something that shocked the ancient world. He announced he was going to invade Persia, not to raid the coast, not to grab some territory. He was going to conquer the entire Persian Empire. People thought he was insane. The Persian Empire was not just a country, it was the superpower of the ancient world. It stretched from Egypt to the borders of India, from the Black Sea to the Arabian Desert. It had been ruling for 200 years. It had crushed every enemy it ever faced. It had gold, it had manpower, and it had the great king, Darius III. Darius was not a warrior like Alexander. He was an administrator. He had been chosen by the Persian nobility precisely because he was safe, predictable, and controllable. But Darius had something Alexander did not have. He had unlimited resources. When Alexander crossed into Asia with 47,000 men, Darius could theoretically raise armies 10 times that size. On paper, Alexander did not stand a chance. But Alexander was not interested in what was on paper. He had studied the Persians his entire life. His tutor had been Aristotle, who had taught him not just philosophy, but strategy, logistics, and the art of exploiting weaknesses. Alexander knew that the Persian Empire was vast but hollow. It was a collection of conquered peoples held together by force and fear. If he could defeat the Persian army in a single decisive battle, the entire empire would collapse like a house of cards. The Persians had tried to stop him before. At the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander had crossed a river under fire and smashed the Persian cavalry in a frontal assault that should have killed him. At the Battle of Issus, Darius himself had taken the field with a massive army, and Alexander had routed him so completely that Darius abandoned his own mother, wife, and children as he fled. After Issus, Alexander spent 2 years consolidating his position. He marched down the coast of the Mediterranean, capturing every Persian port so that their navy could not threaten his supply lines. He besieged the island fortress of Tyre for 7 months, building a causeway across the sea just to reach it. He marched into Egypt, where the locals welcomed him as a liberator and crowned him pharaoh. During all this time, Darius was preparing. He knew he had made mistakes. At Granicus, he had underestimated Alexander. At Issus, he had fought in a narrow valley where his numbers meant nothing. This time, Darius was going to choose the battlefield. He was going to lure Alexander onto flat, open ground where the Persian cavalry could maneuver freely, and he was going to bury him under sheer weight of numbers. Darius sent messengers to every corner of his empire. Levies came from Bactria, from Sogdia, from India. War elephants were brought from the eastern provinces. Scythe chariots were built, war machines with spinning blades attached to the wheels, designed to cut through infantry formations like a blender. The great king assembled the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. The exact numbers are disputed by historians. Ancient sources claim Darius had over 1 million men. Modern scholars think that is propaganda and put the number closer to 200,000, but even that conservative estimate means Alexander was outnumbered more than 4 to 1. Darius had 15,000 cavalry. Alexander had 7,000. Darius had war elephants and scythe chariots. Alexander had none. On every metric that mattered, Alexander was outmatched. But Alexander had something Darius did not have. He had an army that worshipped him. His men had followed him for 3 years. They had crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts. They had never lost a battle. They believed he was invincible. And more importantly, he believed it too. When Alexander received word that Darius was gathering his forces near a town called Gaugamela, he did not retreat. He did not try to avoid the fight. He marched directly toward it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. One battle to decide the fate of empires. Winner takes all. Loser ceases to exist. As the Macedonian army marched across Mesopotamia in the brutal heat of late summer, Alexander was thinking about terrain. Darius had chosen Gaugamela for a reason. It was a flat plain near the Tigris River, perfect cavalry country. The Persians had even prepared the battlefield. They had flattened the ground, removed rocks, and smoothed out any obstacles that might interfere with their chariots. They had turned the plain into a killing floor. Alexander's scouts reported back with grim news. The Persian army was massive. It covered the plain from one end to the other. The cavalry wings alone were larger than Alexander's entire army. Some of Alexander's officers suggested a night attack. Hit the Persians while they are sleeping, create chaos, maybe even capture Darius in his tent. It was the smart play. It was the safe play. Alexander refused. He said something that has echoed through military history for 2,000 years. "I will not steal victory like a thief." It sounds arrogant, and it was. But it was also strategic. Alexander understood that defeating Darius was not enough. He had to destroy the myth of Persian invincibility. He had to win so decisively, so publicly, so overwhelmingly, that no one would ever question his right to rule. A victory in the dark would always have an asterisk. A victory in the daylight would be undeniable. On the night of September 30th, Alexander gathered his commanders. Parmenion, his second in command, was an old general who had served Alexander's father. He was cautious, experienced, and deeply worried about the odds. He looked at the Persian campfires stretching to the horizon and asked Alexander what the plan was. Alexander's plan was insane. He was going to attack directly at Darius. Not the flanks, not the weak points. He was going to aim his cavalry directly at the center of the Persian line, where the great king sat on his command chariot, surrounded by his elite guard. If Alexander could kill or capture Darius, the battle would be over before it really started. Parmenion pointed out the obvious problem. To reach Darius, Alexander would have to cut through thousands of Persian cavalry. He would be isolated, surrounded, and cut off from the rest of the army. If anything went wrong, Alexander would be captured or killed, and the war would be over. Alexander looked at Parmenion and smiled. He said that nothing was going to go wrong. He said that Darius would panic. He said that the Persians would break, and then he went to bed. While his officers paced and planned, Alexander slept like a baby. His staff had to wake him up when the sun rose. This was not bravado. It was genuine confidence. Alexander believed he was going to win because he had never lost. As dawn broke on October 1st, 331 BC, the two armies began to form up. The Persians moved first. Their line extended for nearly 4 miles. On the right wing was Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, with 10,000 cavalry. On the left wing was Mazaeus, the governor of Babylon, with 5,000 cavalry. In the center, directly in front of Darius, were the scythe chariots and the royal guard. Behind them were waves of infantry, archers, and more cavalry. It was a formation designed to envelop and crush. Alexander's deployment was completely different. He formed his army into a giant rectangle. The phalanx infantry, 30,000 men carrying those 18-foot sarissas, formed the center. On the right wing, Alexander himself led the companion cavalry, 2,000 of the finest horsemen in the world. On the left wing, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian cavalry and the allied Greek troops. But here is where Alexander did something brilliant. He created a second line behind his main formation. Reserves, something the Greeks rarely used. These reserve units had one job. If the Persians tried to surround the Macedonians, the reserves would turn and face outward, creating a box formation that could fight in all directions. Alexander was not just planning to survive the Persian numbers. He was planning to turn those numbers against them. As the two armies faced each other across the plain, the psychological pressure must have been overwhelming. The Macedonian soldiers could see the Persian cavalry massing on both flanks. They could hear the rumble of the chariots. They could see the glint of sunlight on thousands of spear tips. Some of them had to be thinking that this was the end, that they had pushed their luck too far, that today was the day the myth died. Alexander rode along the front line on his warhorse Bucephalus. He shouted encouragement to his men. He called out individuals by name, reminding them of battles they had won together. He told them that they were not fighting for plunder or glory. They were fighting for their place in history. They were about to conquer the greatest empire on earth. Their grandchildren would tell stories about this day. And then he did something that shocked everyone. He ordered the entire army to march to the right, not forward, sideways. The Macedonians began sliding across the plain at an angle, moving toward the edge of the prepared battlefield. Darius watched this maneuver with growing alarm. If Alexander moved off the smooth ground, the scythe chariots would be useless. The whole plan would fall apart. Darius could not let that happen. He gave the order. The battle began. The first wave of death came from the chariots. 200 scythe chariots, each pulled by 4 horses, each wheel fitted with spinning blades designed to cut men in half, began their charge toward the Macedonian phalanx. This was supposed to be the shock weapon that would shatter Alexander's formation before the battle even started. The chariots accelerated to a full gallop, closing the distance in seconds. The sound of 800 hooves thundering across the plain was terrifying. The Macedonian phalanx did not waver. They had been trained for this exact moment. As the chariots closed to 200 yards, Alexander gave the signal. The Macedonian light infantry, the hypaspes and the archers, stepped forward and let loose. Hundreds of javelins and arrows arced into the air. The Persian chariot drivers were not armored. They were the first to die. Horses screamed and fell, tangling in their own traces. Chariots flipped, spilling their crews onto the ground. But some chariots made it through the first volley. This is where the Macedonian training paid off. As the chariots crashed into the phalanx, the infantry did not stand there and get slaughtered. They opened gaps in their formation, creating lanes for the chariots to pass through. It was like water flowing around rocks. The chariots, unable to stop their momentum, rolled through the Macedonian lines and came out the other side, where the reserve infantry was waiting. The chariot crews were pulled down and butchered. In less than 5 minutes, Darius had lost his shock weapon. The scythe chariots, which should have broken the Macedonian center, had accomplished nothing. But the real battle was just beginning. Seeing the chariots fail, Bessus on the Persian right wing launched his cavalry charge. 10,000 horsemen, the finest from Bactria and Sogdia, swept toward the Macedonian left flank. Their goal was simple: ride around the Macedonian army, attack from behind, and turn the battle into a massacre. Parmenion on the Macedonian left saw them coming. He had 4,000 cavalry and light infantry. He was outnumbered more than 2-1. He could not stop them. He could only slow them down. The Thessalian cavalry crashed into the Persian horsemen in a swirling melee. For the next hour, this wing would become a desperate holding action, a grinding, chaotic fight where neither side could gain the advantage. But that was exactly what Alexander needed. While Bessus was occupied trying to break Parmenion, Alexander was executing the most audacious cavalry charge in military history. He had been waiting for a gap. The Persian cavalry charges had created a hole in their line, not a huge hole, not an obvious hole, just a small weakness where the cavalry had moved forward and the center had not kept pace. It was a seam in the Persian formation that most generals would not even notice. Alexander noticed. He turned to his companion cavalry and gave the order, "Follow me." 2,000 Macedonian horsemen formed into a wedge formation, with Alexander at the tip. They did not charge straight ahead. They charged at an angle, aiming directly at the gap in the Persian line. This was not a wide sweeping maneuver. This was a surgical strike. The objective was not the Persian infantry. The objective was Darius. The companion cavalry hit the Persian line at full gallop. The impact was devastating. Macedonian lances punched through armor. War horses trampled infantry. The wedge drove deeper and deeper into the Persian formation, widening the gap with every second. Behind them, the hypaspists, Alexander's elite foot soldiers, poured into the breach. The Persian center began to collapse. Units that had been standing firm suddenly found Macedonian cavalry in their rear. Panic spread like wildfire. And then someone in the Persian ranks looked toward the command chariot and realized what was happening. Alexander was cutting directly toward the great king. Darius stood in his massive command chariot, surrounded by his personal guard. These were the immortals, 10,000 elite infantry who had sworn to die before letting the king fall into enemy hands. But they had never faced anything like this. Alexander was not commanding from a distance. He was at the front of the charge, his armor splattered with blood, his spear breaking and being replaced over and over as he fought his way forward. The Persian guards did their job. They formed a wall around Darius. They died by the dozens trying to stop the Macedonian wedge. But Alexander kept coming. He was within 100 yards of the great king. Then 50 yards. Darius could see his face. And that is when Darius broke. For the second time in his life, the great king of Persia turned his chariot around and fled. He abandoned his army. He abandoned his empire. He ran. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Persian soldiers saw their king fleeing, and the will to fight evaporated. If the great king was running, what were they dying for? Units began to dissolve. Men dropped their weapons and ran. What had been the largest army in the ancient world became a mob of terrified refugees. But the battle was not over yet. While Alexander was chasing Darius, disaster was unfolding on the Macedonian left. Mazaeus, the Persian commander on the left wing, had broken through Parmenion's line. 5,000 Persian cavalry had smashed their way past the Thessalians and were now rampaging through the Macedonian camp, killing baggage handlers and looting supplies. Parmenion sent an urgent message to Alexander. "The left wing is collapsing. Come back or we lose everything." For Alexander, this was the ultimate test. He could chase Darius and possibly capture the great king, ending the war in one stroke. Or he could turn back and save his own army from disaster. Most generals would have chosen glory. Alexander chose survival. He wheeled the companion cavalry around and charged back toward the left wing. But as he turned, he ran into a new problem. The Persian cavalry that had broken through was now trying to retreat. They saw Alexander coming and panicked. What followed was a running battle, a chaotic melee where both sides were trying to break contact. Men fought hand-to-hand in small knots of violence that broke apart and reformed. This phase of the battle was actually more dangerous for Alexander than the initial charge. In the disciplined attack on Darius, the Macedonians had overwhelming momentum. In this confused fighting withdrawal, anything could happen. Alexander himself was nearly killed when a Persian noble recognized him and made a suicide charge. The Persian's lance punched through Alexander's breastplate, grazing his ribs. If the blow had been 2 inches to the left, Alexander would have died, and history would have been completely different. But the companion cavalry held together. They cut their way through the Persian retreat and linked up with Parmenion. The Thessalian cavalry, exhausted but unbroken, rallied. Together, they turned and charged Mazaeus. The Persian left wing, seeing Darius had fled and now facing fresh Macedonian cavalry, broke and ran. By mid-afternoon, the Battle of Gaugamela was over. The Persian army did not retreat, it disintegrated. Soldiers threw away their weapons and armor so they could run faster. Officers abandoned their units. Entire formations dissolved into panicked mobs. The Macedonians pursued for hours, cutting down thousands of fleeing Persians. When Alexander finally called off the pursuit and ordered his men to regroup, his officers began tallying the casualties. The numbers were almost impossible to believe. The Macedonians had lost fewer than 500 men killed. Most of those losses had come from Parmenion's desperate holding action on the left wing. Alexander's cavalry charge, the most dangerous part of the battle, had lost fewer than 100 men. The Persian losses were catastrophic. Ancient sources claim 300,000 dead. Modern historians think that is an exaggeration, and put the number closer to 40,000 killed and wounded. But even that conservative estimate means Alexander achieved a kill ratio of more than 80-1. It was not just a victory, it was an extermination. But the real prize was not the body count, it was what happened next. With Darius on the run and the Persian army destroyed, the entire empire collapsed. Within weeks, Babylon opened its gates to Alexander. Within months, Susa and Persepolis, the ancient capitals of Persia, surrendered. The Persian nobility began switching sides, pledging loyalty to the new conqueror. Darius ran all the way to the eastern edge of his empire, trying to raise a new army. But his own nobles had lost faith in him. He had fled twice. He had abandoned his men. He was no longer seen as the great king, but as a coward. In the summer of 330 BC, Darius was assassinated by Bessus, the same man who had commanded the right wing at Gaugamela. Bessus declared himself the new great king, but it was a meaningless title. Alexander was the real master of Asia now. Alexander took Darius's death seriously. When he found the body, he ordered it to be buried with full royal honors. He hunted down Bessus and executed him for regicide. Alexander understood symbols. He was not just conquering the Persian Empire, he was claiming to be its legitimate heir. He married Persian noblewomen. He adopted Persian court customs. He declared himself the successor to the Achaemenid dynasty. But the question that historians have been arguing about for 2,000 years is simple. How did he do it? How did 47,000 men destroy 200,000? How did Alexander win a battle he had no right to win? The answer is not one thing. It is everything. Start with the army. The Macedonian phalanx was not just a formation. It was a military revolution. Those 18-foot sarissas created a wall of steel that no cavalry could penetrate. The Persians had not seen anything like it. Their cavalry charges, which had worked against every other enemy, broke against the phalanx, like waves against a cliff. But the phalanx alone was not enough. Phalanxes are slow and inflexible. They can hold ground, but they cannot exploit opportunities. That is where the companion cavalry came in. Alexander had trained his heavy cavalry to operate in perfect coordination with the infantry. The phalanx would pin the enemy in place. The cavalry would smash them from the side. It was the ancient world's version of combined arms warfare. Then there was the tactical genius. Alexander's oblique attack, where he moved his army sideways to draw the Persians out of position, was brilliant. His exploitation of the gap in the Persian line required perfect timing and superhuman courage. His decision to turn back and save Parmenion instead of chasing glory showed that he was not just brave, but smart. But most importantly, there was morale. The Macedonians believed they were invincible. They trusted Alexander completely. When he charged directly at the great king, they followed without hesitation. When the Persian cavalry broke through their left wing, they did not panic. They held the line and waited for Alexander to come back. That kind of discipline cannot be faked. It is built over years of training and winning. The Persians, on the other hand, were fighting for a king they did not respect. Darius had been chosen because he was safe, not because he was inspiring. When he fled, no one was surprised. The Persian army was not a unified force. It was a collection of subject peoples who had been dragged to the battlefield against their will. They had no loyalty to each other or to Darius. When the center broke, the rest of the army had no reason to keep fighting. Gaugamela was not just a battle, it was the end of an era. The Persian Empire, which had ruled the Near East for 2 centuries, ceased to exist. The age of the Eastern empires was over. The age of Greek dominance had begun. Alexander would go on to conquer all the way to India before dying at the age of 32, probably from malaria or typhoid. But his empire did not survive him. It fractured into warring successor kingdoms. Yet the legacy of Gaugamela lived on. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's conquests would dominate the Mediterranean and Near East for 3 centuries. Greek became the common language of trade and scholarship. Greek art, philosophy, and military tactics spread from Egypt to Afghanistan. The Roman legions that eventually conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms used tactics learned from the Macedonian phalanx. The entire Western military tradition traces its roots back to that flat plain in northern Iraq, where a 25-year-old king destroyed an empire with 47,000 men. If you visit the site of Gaugamela today, there is nothing there. No monument, no museum. Just farmers working the same flat land where 200,000 men once stood in formation. But standing there, you can almost hear the rumble of the cavalry charge, the crash of the phalanx engaging, the screams of the dying. You can imagine Alexander at the head of his companions, lance in hand, charging directly at the great king. The Battle of Gaugamela teaches us that warfare is not just about numbers. It is about leadership, about training, about morale, and about seizing the moment when it comes. Alexander won because he was willing to take risks that no sane general would take. He won because his men would follow him into hell if he asked. And he won because he understood that in war, as in life, fortune favors the bold. For the Macedonians who stood in that phalanx and watched 200,000 Persians form up across the plain, the victory must have felt like a miracle. They had been outnumbered, outmatched, and out-resourced. But they had something the Persians did not have. They had Alexander. And on that October morning in 331 BC, that was enough. The legacy of Gaugamela extends far beyond the immediate conquest of Persia. It fundamentally changed how the ancient world thought about military power. Before Alexander, the prevailing wisdom was that bigger was better. A large empire with enormous armies would always defeat a smaller force. Gaugamela proved that wrong. It showed that discipline, tactics, and leadership could overcome raw numbers. The military innovations that Alexander used at Gaugamela became the template for Western warfare for centuries. The concept of combined arms, using infantry and cavalry in coordinated attacks, became standard practice. The idea of creating reserves that could respond to unexpected threats became fundamental to military planning. The aggressive use of cavalry as a decisive strike force rather than just as scouts or skirmishers changed how battles were fought. But perhaps the most important lesson of Gaugamela was psychological. Alexander understood that battles are won in the mind before they are won on the field. He cultivated an aura of invincibility. He led from the front, sharing the same dangers as his men. He knew their names, their stories, their fears. When they looked at him, they did not see a distant aristocrat. They saw a fellow warrior who happened to be king. This personal leadership style was revolutionary. Most ancient rulers commanded from behind the lines, surrounded by bodyguards, issuing orders from a safe distance. Alexander fought in the front rank. At Gaugamela, he personally led the charge that broke the Persian center. His breastplate was dented by a lance. His shield was shattered by arrows. He bled alongside his men. That kind of leadership inspires a loyalty that no amount of gold can buy. For the Persians, Gaugamela was a tragedy born of arrogance. They had the numbers. They had the resources. They had prepared the battlefield to maximize their advantages. But they underestimated their enemy. They looked at the Macedonians and saw barbarians from the edges of the civilized world. They did not see the most disciplined, best trained, and most motivated army of their age. Darius made fatal errors throughout the campaign. After losing at Issus, he should have stripped Alexander of legitimacy by cutting off his retreat and starving him out. Instead, he let Alexander consolidate his position for 2 years. At Gaugamela, Darius should have used his numerical advantage to surround and overwhelm the Macedonians. Instead, he deployed in a linear formation that allowed Alexander to concentrate his forces at a single point of attack. But the biggest error was Darius himself. He was not a warrior. He was not charismatic. He did not inspire confidence. When he fled from Issus, he damaged his reputation. When he fled from Gaugamela, he destroyed it. An army can overcome many disadvantages, but it cannot overcome a leader who runs away while his men are still fighting. The battle also highlighted the importance of terrain analysis. Alexander's sideways march was not just a tactical maneuver. It was psychological warfare. He forced Darius to react, to launch his attacks before he was ready. The scythed chariots, which should have been held in reserve and used at the decisive moment, were wasted in a premature charge that accomplished nothing. By the time the real battle began, Darius had already lost his trump card. Modern military academies still study Gaugamela. The United States Military Academy at West Point includes it in their curriculum on decisive battles. The British Army Staff College at Camberley uses it as a case study in leadership under pressure. The fundamentals of what Alexander did, fixing the enemy with infantry while striking decisively with mobile forces, remain relevant in an age of tanks and helicopters. But Gaugamela was also the beginning of the end for Alexander, in a way he did not anticipate. He had achieved his goal. He had conquered the Persian Empire. He was master of the known world. But he was only 25 years old. What do you do when you have achieved everything by the time you are 25? Alexander kept going. He marched east into Afghanistan, fighting brutal mountain campaigns against guerrilla fighters. He crossed into India and defeated King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. But his army was exhausted. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. They wanted to go home. At the Hyphasis River in India, his men mutinied. For the first time in his life, Alexander had to retreat. The return journey was a disaster. Alexander marched his army through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth. Thousands died of thirst and heat. By the time they reached Babylon, Alexander was a changed man. He had survived countless battles without a scratch, only to be worn down by fever and exhaustion. In June of 323 BC, at the age of 32, Alexander died in Babylon. Some say it was malaria, some say it was poisoning, some say it was the cumulative effect of a dozen untreated wounds and years of hard living. His empire died with him. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up his conquests and spent the next 40 years fighting over the pieces. But the world Alexander left behind was fundamentally different from the one he was born into. Greek culture, language, and military tactics had spread from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. The successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, and the Antigonids in Macedon, would shape the course of Mediterranean history for 300 years. When Rome eventually conquered these kingdoms, they inherited the Hellenistic world that Alexander had created. Roman generals studied Alexander's campaigns. Julius Caesar reportedly wept when he visited a statue of Alexander, lamenting that he had achieved so little by the same age. The Roman military borrowed heavily from Macedonian tactics. The gladius, the short stabbing sword that became the signature weapon of the Roman legions, was inspired by the weapons Alexander's high paspists used to fight in close quarters. The cultural impact was even more profound. The Hellenistic period saw the rise of new philosophies, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism. The Library of Alexandria, founded by Alexander's general Ptolemy, became the intellectual center of the ancient world. Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean, which is why the New Testament was written in Greek centuries later. The fusion of Greek and Near Eastern cultures created a cosmopolitan world that had never existed before. All of this traces back to that October day at Gaugamela. If Darius had won, the Persian Empire would have survived. Greek culture would have remained confined to the Aegean. The Roman Empire might have looked completely different. The entire trajectory of Western civilization hinged on a 25-year-old king's decision to charge directly at an army 4 times his size. For the soldiers who fought at Gaugamela, the victory must have felt surreal. They had done the impossible. They had defeated an army that stretched from horizon to horizon. They had seen their king break the enemy with a single charge. They had watched the great king of Persia flee like a common criminal. They had conquered the richest empire in the world, but the cost was high. Many of those 47,000 men would never see home again. They would die in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Persia, or the jungles of India. They had signed up for a campaign to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor. They ended up conquering half of Asia. They followed Alexander to the edge of the known world and beyond. The Battle of Gaugamela stands as one of the most decisive military engagements in human history. It ended a 200-year-old empire in an afternoon. It established Alexander as the greatest general of antiquity. It demonstrated that superior tactics and leadership can overcome overwhelming numerical odds, and it changed the political and cultural landscape of the ancient world forever. When military historians rank the greatest battles of all time, Gaugamela always makes the top 10. Some put it at number 1. The kill ratio alone, 80-1, is almost unheard of in ancient warfare. The strategic consequences, the fall of an empire, and the birth of the Hellenistic world are difficult to match. And the tactical execution, a frontal assault that somehow turned into a decisive victory, defies conventional military wisdom. The genius of Alexander at Gaugamela was his ability to see the battle as a whole. He understood that defeating the Persian army was not enough. He had to destroy their will to fight. He did that by targeting Darius directly. He understood that the Persian army was not loyal to Persia. It was loyal to the great king. Kill or capture the great king, and the army would collapse. It was a psychological strategy as much as a military one. He also understood his own limitations. When Parmenion called for help, Alexander did not hesitate. He turned back. He sacrificed the glory of capturing Darius to save his own army. That decision saved the campaign. If the Persian cavalry had destroyed the Macedonian camp and then attacked the phalanx from behind, the battle could have ended very differently. Alexander knew when to be bold and when to be cautious. That balance is what separates great generals from reckless ones. The men who fought at Gaugamela became legends in their own lifetimes. The companion cavalry who charged with Alexander into the heart of the Persian army were celebrated in poems and histories. The infantry who held the line against overwhelming odds were honored as the men who conquered Asia. When these veterans returned home years later, they were treated as living heroes. They had achieved something that most people thought was impossible. But for Alexander, Gaugamela was not the end. It was the beginning. With Persia conquered, he pushed east into territory that not even the Persians had fully controlled. He fought in Central Asia, in the Hindu Kush Mountains, in the Indus Valley. He crossed rivers that Greek geographers had never heard of. He saw war elephants and monsoons. He married a Bactrian princess and adopted Persian customs. He tried to create a fusion empire that would unite East and West under his rule. It was an ambitious vision, perhaps too ambitious. His Macedonian veterans resented his adoption of Persian dress and customs. They thought he was betraying his Greek heritage. His Persian subjects saw him as just another conqueror. He was caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. When he died, that vision died with him. His generals divided his empire along ethnic and cultural lines. The fusion never happened, yet the legacy lived on in unexpected ways. The Greek cities Alexander founded throughout Asia, the Alexandrias, became centers of Hellenistic culture. Greek settlers married local women. Greek and Persian art merged into new styles. The Silk Road, which would connect Europe and Asia for centuries, followed many of the routes Alexander's army had pioneered. In India, Greek influence on Buddhist art created the Gandhara style, where Buddha was depicted for the first time in human form, looking strangely like a Greek god. All of this flowed from Gaugamela. That single battle broke open a world that had been closed. It connected civilizations that had barely known each other existed. It showed that the old order, the mighty Persian Empire that had seemed eternal, was not invincible. It proved that a determined leader with a small elite force could overcome any obstacle. The Battle of Gaugamela is a reminder that history is not inevitable. The Persian Empire did not have to fall. If Darius had been a better general, if Alexander had been slightly less bold, if the companion cavalry had been stopped short of the Persian center, the entire course of Western civilization would have been different. We often think of history as a series of inevitable progressions, but battles like Gaugamela show how fragile those progressions are. A few thousand men, a few critical decisions, a few minutes of chaos, and empires fall. For the modern reader or listener, Gaugamela offers lessons that extend beyond military tactics. It shows the power of decisive leadership. Alexander did not win because he had better technology or more resources. He won because he was willing to take risks, and his men trusted him enough to follow. It shows the importance of morale. The Macedonians fought harder than the Persians because they believed in their cause and their leader. And it shows that numbers are not everything. Focus, discipline, and the ability to exploit opportunities matter more than raw size. As you stand there in that Macedonian phalanx, looking out at the largest army ever assembled, you realize something profound. You are not just fighting for your king or your country. You are fighting for your place in history. You are part of something larger than yourself. And when the sun sets on this October day and the dust finally settles, you will have been part of the most improbable, most decisive, and most important victory in ancient warfare. You will have destroyed an empire. You will have changed the world. And you will have done it with fewer than 500 casualties. That is the miracle of Gaugamela. That is the genius of Alexander. And that is why, 2,300 years later, we still tell this story.